the self alone exists. This knowledge, which is not for any other, but only for the self, by the self, in the self, of the self, is realized conclusively in a self-evident manner by all who, following Sri Bhagavan's direction to inquire, who am I, realize the ever non-existence of an individual entity. In the unreality of the individual shines the reality of the self, in which there is no ignorance, no bondage, no potential for suffering, no duality of any kind. To realize the non-dual truth, inquire. Determine the nature of your own being. That which knows being is being. Brahman knows Brahman. The individual or ego never really came to be. Knowledge of this is spoken of as its end. Really, it is only the self, which is perfectly full at all times, that exists. The essence is always egoless. And the means of practice is egolessness. That which adheres to egolessness is devotion to truth. That which reveals the ego was never born is knowledge. If the ego is not, there is no doubt about anything else. And the perfect fullness of the real self is found to be existing uninterruptedly forever. Now, if you have a question about this, please feel free to ask. Or if you want to relate your own experience, at any point, please feel free to speak.
In Ramana's instruction, who am I? I started to think about that. Why does he have me ask that question? In it is kind of implied that I must not know who I am, and that finding that out would be a good thing to do. So, if there's somebody who doesn't know who they are, how is that one going to figure out who they are if they don't know who they are now? So it's like, who's this one who doesn't know about himself? So what I did was just to sort of set that aside and say, okay, maybe there's somebody who doesn't know about themselves, but I'm just going to not worry about that one and just find out about this one. And how am I going to know myself? What is it that allows me to know who I am? And it brings me to my existence as the only thing that I know directly.
Then that contradicts the presumption with which you started.
Where did I start?
The supposition that there must be someone who does not know who he is.
It was a supposition. Yeah, it was more like a place to start. But it's not...
The inquiry actually doesn't assume anything. It just starts with the basic existence, which is beyond doubt by all. That's why, as he said, it's the only means that does not include the dualities that one is trying to transcend. Such as, I am one who knows, and that is something to be known. The experience directly shows the efficacy of inquiring, who am I? It causes your vision to become non-objective. That is, it abandons the entire conception that there's a this, an objective portion of one's experience. And it also consumes the I, for whom this would be. He has said that the I that seems to be integral to the inquiry gets burned up like the stick in the funeral pyre in the very course of the inquiry.
The experience is being swallowed up by yourself.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
To where there's no other self.
Now, if we assume that the individual exists and take that as the supposition, then as he has said in his 5 verses on the one self, that is like a drunken man forgetting who he is and giving a performance in the midst of a crowd, asking, where am I and who am I, while all along he is himself. Where there is no other, where being and knowing are one and the same thing, That's the place of the inquiry. That's the place of self-knowledge.
I don't know, the idea that I could pretend that I'm something else is really quite pointless.
That idea also gets swallowed up or consumed in the inquiry. Who would harbor pointless ideas?
Who would harbor any ideas?
I am separate from the self. The I that supposes that is already considered separate from the self. Who is he?
He's like an imposter, out of control at times.
So the Maharshi said he's like the uninvited wedding guest who's not actually invited by the groom or the bride. He seems to take all he wants until he's wanted on some important matter. In other words, his identity, whereupon he quickly disappears from the scene.
Yeah. Yeah, when you actually say,
He's an imposter. He's not.
who are you?
He vanishes.
He does.
So the inquiry doesn't really suppose anything, does it? Just based in reality.
If it was supposing something, it wouldn't be inquiry, it would be something else.
And it would lose its liberating power.
Yeah, it would go off into some objective whatever, and
Or it would only take one thus far, but no further.
yeah. Yeah, it's getting very hard to go very far. For a couple reasons. One is I know I have to pretend something, or I have to make a whole story up. And to make up that story and then maintain it with all the suffering that goes along with it, it's just like, no. It's just...
It runs contrary to your nature.
It does. It's just a... It's just a few small habits that can be easily broken when you inquire.
The habits, the vasanas, the tendencies, they get broken. I would say they get pulled out by the root, but they turn out to be rootless. And the potential for them, the one who engages in them, the one who imagines them, the starting point, the I mode, aham vritti, proves to be unreal, utterly unreal. So that there is no one to create the tendencies, nor was there anyone actually in them.
If I now try to imagine a tendency or a vasana, they're very, very hollow. There's nobody who's actually in those dreams. As far as somebody real in them, there's nobody real in those dreams.
Inquiry enables you to discover how true that is. And then a dream which really did not begin is said to be over.
Thank you, Master. As I listen, and you give advice regarding, say, supposition or doubt, it sounded like, to me, a subtler version of something I heard in your discourse where you simply referred to ego, or the lack of it, as what opens the way. And when you were saying it during the discourse, it occurred to me that a train of thought or a dream or a story of any kind of stories that can come from any part of human storytelling. It almost always has the same pattern, that as long as the ego is in subsidence, progress in any given direction seems to go wondrously well. And then the stories that go bad are the ones where, at a certain point, the character goes, well, come this far, now it's okay to let the ego have free reign, and it doesn't. It's like, it's so obvious, but I can't recall it ever being mentioned that the best intentions reflected, even in a dream, really parallel the subsidence of the ego, and then confusion and just bad outcomes pretty well parallel the release of ego. So that if someone was inquiring, and let's say there was a doubt or supposition or confusion or a sense of, well, I'm dense with regard to this or something like that, it seems you could almost ask, well, is that an ego expression, or is that more of a humble being open to the teachings of the sages? And it would always be the first. So whether it's a dramatic story or something as subtle as the inward turning of a mind, so long as the ego is just not given free rein, things will tend to go well.
So the ego is at the root of everything that's of the nature of suffering, bondage, unhappiness, discord,
Even doubt,
desire,
supposition.
doubt, anger, and so forth, and everything that's better to be without. While egolessness, or anything that adheres or goes in that direction, is at the root of everything that is of a divine nature, and all happiness, all peace, fearlessness, joy, etc. Not only is this true in terms of intentions and the story, as you put it, but how else to bring the story to a conclusion, which is the most blessed state, except by abiding in egolessness.
And it seems to apply even down to what might be considered the more subtle obstructions, or whatever they'd be called. They're just maybe less distinct versions of the same.
Mm-hmm. Whether the definitions encrusting the ego be apparently gross or subtle, or right down just to the notion that the ego is and is important, etc. No matter how they appear, they are all equally false, and they're all equally useless.
And detrimental.
And anything that is inclined towards egolessness shines, to the degree of its egolessness, with the truth. And truth is always beneficial. Indeed, if there's any kind of obstruction towards one's spiritual aspiration, if the aspirant would simply remove whatever the ego notion is, or the manifestation of that ego notion, the obstruction would dissolve right before him. What else constitutes an obstruction toward liberation except the ideas regarding the I? Even the idea I am obstructed is based firmly on the idea of I. All kinds of suffering are very self-centered, aren't they?
Well, I mean,
In an egotistical way.
it's easy to hear, well, oh, the ego is that which gloats, but it has to also be remembered it's that which wallows as well.
Yes, it wallows. It wallows in its own imagination.
Uh-huh. There's a sort of perverse satisfaction in minor suffering, or maybe not so minor, but self-imposed suffering.
But what kind of satisfaction is it?
It's not comprehensible.
It's very unsatisfactory.
So it seemed like such a simple instruction, but so powerful. Just take the ego out of everything.
And the most direct way to take the ego out of everything is to find out if it exists. If the ego proves non-existent, then there's no starting place for the rest of the delusion. There's nothing to which to adhere the delusion. If there is no ego, there are no differences anywhere. If there is no ego, there's no one to imagine the bondage and then get caught up in what he's imagined. If there is no ego, there alone is satisfaction. There can never be any satisfaction in suffering. So inquire within yourself. Determine exactly what is this I. If it seems as if individualized, hence an ego, discern what it is. Penetrate through the seeming and discern what it actually is. If you do that, only the self will be found. There won't be a trace of ego anywhere, and no one will be able to say where it went.
So, trying to continue along that same thing. I guess what I'm noticing is, so for some time it's been apparent that there's no center. There just is no center. But that seems to have become its own incrustation, its own kind of calcification. Like, so it seems to prevent any further going in. Like everywhere I look, I don't see anything. I don't see any center for me, for who I imagine myself to be. When I actually look, whenever I look, I don't find a center. But it's almost like then that kind of surrounds itself and becomes its own barrier. So that the imagining that there is somebody keeps presenting itself. So I keep looking, I don't find any center, but then it reemerges, and I ask the question again. So how do I go deeper?
From where does it emerge?
Thought.
And where does thought emerge?
It seems to be here. It seems to be that particular kind of thought emerges from here.
When you say here, do you mean the body?
From the body, from the center of the body. Well, I guess as the Maharshi said, the heart, go for the eye and the heart. And lately that's happened a few times.
Do you ever have
the physical center?
Do you ever have thoughts that are not connected with the body?
I think I do.
So where do those thoughts emerge?
Beats me.
The body itself.
Assumption. So I've seen the answers written, so I go to the answers that I've seen written. But that doesn't.
The scriptural answers point you to know yourself. If we make them a topic of study, we learn the answer. We must proceed from there to experientially verify the truth of it. The body itself is a thought. Thought cannot arise from that. Where does thought come from?
So thought's coming from the mind, not mind, but the body, from the physical structure in the body.
But you have thoughts that are not physically connected, as you mentioned before. So
Well, no, I don't. That goes to no thought, I think. I think whenever so when I find myself in the inquiry, as I do during the course of the day, asking myself, who am I? Who is this who's suffering? Who is this who's apparently doing? Then it goes to no center, and there's no thought there.
yes,
It's almost immediately back out.
it must come out from somewhere. There must be some root. There must be someone for whom all that is being experienced.
So I guess the only answer is to just keep inquiring.
Yes, if one would keep inquiring, there would not be any differentiation ever. But inquiry is not an activity. If it's conducted like an activity of mind, there will be breaks in it. And there'll be going in and going out. In your dream, you're endowed with apparently a dream body. Would you say your dream thoughts come from your dream body? Oh, it doesn't make any sense, does it? The waking state is very similar to the dream. The subject-object relation is similar. The body is merely a thought. A kind of thought called sensation determines the experience of the body, apart from which you have no experience of a body. But you do experience your own existence always, whether thought is present or not, whether the body is present or not. What's the nature of that existence? That existence is the same regardless of whether you think you're withdrawing or going out, encrusted, free, bound, etc. What is the nature of that existence? You know you exist even without thinking about it. And you don't require a body or bodily sensation. Even in deep sleep, you know that you exist, though there is no thought, I exist. That existence should know itself as it is, at the same depth that you know that you are. That is the inquiry. It is no mere mental process.
So you can't say beyond, it's beyond thought, is what occurs to me. it's just the presence, it's just my existence, the knowing of my existence, without any added to. Okay.
Add the I notion to existence, and you treat the existence as if it were something objective, and the individual as if it was your identity. The individual is a ghost with no form of its own, as the Maharshi has said, so it takes a form. Further misidentification with thought occurs. One pattern of thinking is sensation in the body. Then you feel, I am the body, I am in the body, my body is the start of my existence, the body is the start of my thought. And nothing could be further from the truth.
That's exactly what's happening. That's it.
So if you find yourself rolling along that way, tumbling downhill, so to speak, go back the way you came. Trace out your own existence.
This all really good dialogues is, I've been thinking about this, and your description of self-inquiry. And without, obviously, any ideas, self-inquiry would be obvious, would be totally apparent. What is real, and I assume what is not real. And this is what I'm kind of theorizing, although it seems to be more and more my experience. Now, what I thought was totally cool is that self-inquiry is totally non-objective. I mean, it's... So in other words, I leave anything to do with the world of mind, all that's gone. So now I'm just looking for myself. However, that's somewhat difficult or hampered by ideas to the contrary, like, I am a mind with sprouts of other things coming out.
But those ideas, whether they be of the mind or the universe, are yours. They don't speak of themselves. They are known by you. And apart from your knowing of them, they don't exist. They do not declare their own reality. You say, I know this. It is. All of this depends on you. Inquiry to know the self is discernment of what is real. Knowledge of reality is actually just knowledge of the self.
As opposed to knowledge of the self. In other words, would it be as opposed to anything?
Anything opposing would be still dependent on the I that knows it. So, in that sense, self-knowledge is not opposed to anything, but does transcend all.
So, in a sense, what you just described, at least what it seemed like, is the actual inquiry itself. That the real knower in this case isn't at all connected to the objects.
If just the known were subtracted from the knower, that would suffice.
So similarly with any idea that would appear in the mind. So anything.
If the known or objective part of the idea is removed, what remains?
Definitely whatever was believed is gone.
So the known dissolves in the knowing dissolves in the knower. The knower without the known, and not in relation to anything else as, I know this, I know that. The knower just by himself, what is his nature?
That's, yeah, that's different. Yeah, it's not describable.
The ineffable, the inconceivable, the immutable are you. You cannot be anything else. the one knower of a nature that is just pure consciousness is you. How can you say you have ideas?
Yeah, they don't have to pertain to someone.
And that someone is not actually existent. What does exist, the pure consciousness, is solitary being. In that being, there is no means by which differentiation or ideas would arise. Nor is there actually a stoppage of that which did not begin.
Okay, because if it stopped, it would.
It has to be there first. It doesn't continue and it doesn't stop.
Okay, so yeah, that's something I can see that I believe in, right? That it's something stops and begins. Yeah.
But reality does not stop and begin. And truthfully, the unreal cannot be said to begin and to stop.
It's never the experience that it stops and begins. Only thought appears to stop and begin.
If there is thought, it appears to stop and begin, and stop and begin, and stop and begin. But you do not. You're without beginning and without end. If that beginningless, endless being is known as you really are, there is nothing else to begin and to end. The reality is only one. It is not really true to say there's the self plus ideas. You must first imagine yourself to be some kind of individual conceiver, some individualized awareness. Then you can speak of their ideas. Otherwise, there's just the indivisible real self. That is unmixed consciousness, undivided consciousness, indivisible being.